BioCentury This Week is brought to you by IQVIA Biotech. For biotech companies striving to bring innovative therapies to market and maximize patient impact, IQVIA Biotech is the trusted CRO of choice. Backed by 25 years of unparalleled experience and deep therapeutic expertise, our full-service clinical development solutions are purpose-built to accelerate success. IQVIA Biotech helps early-stage biotechs de-risk by developing strategic clinical development plans, guiding drug candidates along the most promising pathways. Leverage data-driven models and dynamic tools to craft a compelling value story and maintain momentum through every phase of drug development.
Amid an exodus of pharmaceutical companies, the new head of the UK's regulatory body, MHRA, is focusing on the country's strengths. We will discuss what is going on at MHRA and more on the latest BioCentury This Week podcast. I'm Jeff Cranmer, executive editor here and host of the BioCentury This Week podcast. And joining me are my colleagues,
Simon Fishburne, editor-in-chief.
Steve Usden, Washington editor.
Stephen Hansen, director of Biopharma Intelligence.
Steve, welcome to the show. I wanted to find out about your conversation with the new head of the MHRA.
So I had an interview with Lawrence Talon. He's been on the job about 5 months. Basically, what we talked about is how does he plan to position MHRA in the UK and globally? I think the summary would be he wants to focus on strengths, which for the UK are science, cell and gene therapies, rare diseases, vaccines, mRNA therapeutics, and he wants to also pursue and continue to pursue a policy which MHRA has been very active in, which is in collaborating with regulators in other countries for mutual recognition and for reliance. The idea basically being that regulators in middle and smaller sized countries can focus on their strengths and kind of reinforce each other, both in terms of technology and in terms of regulatory capacity for things like inspections and reviews.
Steve, so, obviously we can't ignore the news that's come out this week. We're also on the cusp of grand rounds, and we're going to have more to say at the end of the week about the feeling on the ground here regarding Merck pulling out and the pressure being put on by farmers on the UK ecosystem, let's say, specifically on the government. One thing I wanted to ask you, confining the conversation to this, is that one of the complaints, obviously a lot of it is drug pricing, but one of the complaints is that the regulatory environment is too unfriendly as well. That was sort of in Merck's list. Whether that actually is, to what degree that's actually responsible for their decision, I don't know. To what degree do you think that what Lawrence Talon is envisioning, if successful, would actually address the barriers that people see to regulation?
Well, I think that one of the biggest problems in the UK, one of the biggest concerns, is the same as an enormous concern that companies have in the United States, which is the time that it takes to get a clinical trial started and to iterate and to get new first-in-human trials on iterated drugs started. And he announced goals there that, basically would put the UK in line with the United States. It's not going to be as fast as China. It's not going to be fast as some other countries probably. But his goal is to have it, similar to the United States. So I think that would address some of the major issues.
Do you think that's under ambitious, Steve, or do you think that's realistic? How would you rate that?
I think it's realistic, and I think that the talk about the regulatory concerns in the UK is probably just adding something to the laundry list. But the truth is that reimbursement and coverage are the real issues that the farmers are concerned about.
Yeah, I think concerned is an understatement. Furious might be closer to what I think they are.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people have said, and I think that there's a lot of truth in this, that Merck per se is tremendously under pressure and restructuring generally. So a lot of things can be true at the same time. As I said, we'll come back to this issue when we talk to people on the ground. Stephen and I are going to be at Grand Rounds in Cambridge this week. We have Patrick Vallance, Minister for Science, in conversation with Kate Bingham. I am sure there will be questions for him. So it's going to be an interesting week to be here.
And there's another dynamic at play, of course, also, which is that companies are under tremendous pressure from the Trump administration to be seen as investing heavily in the United States in manufacturing and in R&D. And there have been a whole stream of announcements over the last few months of very large investments in both manufacturing and R&D in the United States. It's a zero-sum game. There's only a certain amount of money that companies have to invest globally. And if they're under strong pressure to invest more in the United States, then that makes it more difficult for them to justify investments elsewhere.
Yeah, and even though I keep saying we're not going to talk about it this week, just one more point on that front, which is, there's no question that having farmers involved and on the ground is a huge boost to the ecosystem. I think the question for the UK is how much is it a necessity? So in the US, obviously having them in Boston made a huge difference. The China ecosystem has actually managed to create a lot of momentum without necessarily having R&D as a pillar of it from the pharma companies. And not all ecosystems are the same. There's some people who are saying AI will make the difference, and the UK is strong in that. So we'll see where it goes. But just coming back to where you started, which is what Lawrence Talone is doing at MHRA, I think that is essential. I think that, that's got to be built regardless of whether the government can bring the farmers back to the table, because if they don't have an efficient regulatory environment, it's going to be virtually impossible to make it a place where clinical trials are attractive to run.
Well, and there's more to it also that people should read the interview and the story that I did. But
they absolutely should.
One of the things that he brought up, which I thought was really interesting, is that if you have an environment in which there's a great deal more mutual reliance and mutual recognition, then you can envision a world in which getting an approval, for example, a product approval in the UK, would unlock much bigger markets. If there's a kind of a default assumption that MHRA approval is going to unlock approvals in developing markets, for example,
right.
And those markets are going to become increasingly important, then that, again, makes it more important and more attractive.
Because what you're saying is you're then not talking about a population of 60 million, you're talking about a population of 60 million plus whatever other regions it opens up, right? And that's a very different equation. Absolutely. All right, so having said we wouldn't talk about it, Jeff, let's go back to you.
Simone, you mentioned Grand Rounds. Well, it's the last call to join our conference in Cambridge, U.K. starting this Wednesday. Stephen, reluctantly, Oxford man, coming. Grand Rounds is going to focus on how to make early stage R&D investable and how to overcome key bottlenecks in translation. It's our third Grand Rounds. Our Chicago session was a big hit in June. Debut meeting last year in Nashville, Tennessee. And now we're headed to the UK. There's been a jump in registration since everyone returned from summer. And it's going to be a packed house. There's a sold out presenting company track, sold out academic poster session, and a great lineup of speakers, including Kate Bingham and James Sabry, the former head of deal making at Roche and Genentech, who is now at BioMarin here in California. There'll also be 2 days of partnering and networking. There's still time to register at BioCenturyGrandRoundsEurope.com. You can also register on site in Cambridge on the afternoon of September 17th. We'll be at the Cambridge Union Society and hope to see you there.
Jeff, just one note, we're at the Cambridge Union on Wednesday night, but I believe we will also take walk-ins on Thursday, Friday, which is at Churchill College.
Churchill. I've heard that name before, Simone.
And yes, and we will
he was
be
that fellow that would wake up and drink champagne. Is that
they do like
Churchill?
They do like this Churchill good dude here. But importantly, Jeff, I will be sending you pictures of the buttery.
America, say what you will about it, we don't have butteries here. And I think that might be the cause of many of the problems in this country. Where should we go from here? Hey, why don't we head to Washington to find out about a new piece of legislation that Steve uncovered last week You loved the Biosecure Act, but wait, there's more. Steve.
So the House of Representatives, when they passed the National Defense Authorization Act, included an amendment. The amendment is called the Securing American Funding and Expertise from Adversarial Research Exploitation Act, otherwise known as the Safe Research Act, sponsored by Representative John Moolenaar. The idea is basically to make it impossible for American academics to collaborate with academics in China. What the legislation would do, if it's enacted, and there's a lot of steps that have to happen between now and then, would basically say that it would be impossible to have NIH funding for any researchers who collaborate with researchers at institutions in China that meet certain criteria. And the criteria are very broad. Most universities that scientists in the United States would have collaborators at would meet this criteria. And basically you'd be erecting a wall between the United States and China at an academic level. And I think that it's something that's of real concern. To me, it's a manifestation of this idea that biotechnology and the bioeconomy have been defined as national security issues. That concept is attractive in part because thinking about biotechnology and bioeconomy as national security is a way to get enthusiasm for government support. It's a way to shield the industry from cuts and from some of the negative impacts of anti-science, anti-pharma, and anti-government movements in the United States. But there's a flip side to it. There's a difference between saying that an industry is a strategic asset, which I think anybody would acknowledge that biotech and pharmaceuticals is for the United States. And that's different from saying that it's part of the defense or the military sphere, which most of biotech and most of pharmaceuticals are not. And the problem is that when you muddle these definitions, then you get to a space like where Representative Moolenaar is, where he says, that it's a national security threat to the United States for American researchers who are conducting research on basic science, who are advancing the frontiers of biology, to collaborate with researchers in China. And it's not just a kind of a feel-good issue or something that you think, oh, well, science should be open, and which of course it should. But there are very concrete negative consequences from cutting off collaborations between the United States and China. There are thousands of papers that have been published based on these collaborations, and both parties bring really important insights and resources to the table in these collaborations.
So, Steve, as you know, we are big fans of collaborations, global collaborations, cross-border ones. I think many people can acknowledge that China is almost past a tipping point now in terms of, a little bit like we said before, it's certainly better and healthier for everybody to have these collaborations, but maybe China is less dependent than it was several years ago. One of my questions to you is if you want to handicap the likelihood of this passing. And the reason I ask is that I know that there are reports that sort of fairly big figures have been put in the desired appropriations for NIH. So I wanted to ask you to comment on that, whether it's that there are members of Congress who sort of see the light and will, or what we would consider see the light, and will push back on this, or whether you think that we're really in a completely new era and those voices just aren't there.
First, just the kind of mechanics of what has to happen next. So this has passed the House. In order for it to be enacted into law, it has to get into the final bill, which is probably going to be passed in December. First, the Senate is going to pass a version of the bill. It's likely to be quite different from the House version. And then there's going to be, behind the scenes negotiations between the House and the Senate to come up with a final version of the bill. We don't know how much people in the House, how much they're going to push for this, whether there's going to be any pushback in the Senate. I don't know. I think that shine some light on it is a good thing, because it will hopefully it will encourage people to think about it and to think about the consequences. My guess is that the vast majority of members of the House who voted for this had no idea what it is, and they probably don't understand what the consequences would be of cutting off scientific collaboration between the United States and China either. If all of that comes out, maybe this won't happen. I think that there's enthusiasm in Congress in general for disentangling the United States and China in any respects where that is possible. And I think that they'll see science and technology as a particularly ripe area for it. And I think there's also kind of a conflation between different areas of science and technology. The bill that the House passed doesn't specifically call out biotech or the life sciences. And I think that's probably why it hasn't gotten any attention, because people don't realize it. But it would have those consequences.
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly those of us who think that American primacy isn't a given can envisage this in the long term becoming a huge own goal, right? Basically, the US disentangling itself while Chinese researchers can go making discoveries and partnering with other people all over the world who aren't doing this. So it's not necessarily a strategic benefit to the US to do this.
To put it gently. Yeah, I've noticed like Canada is advertising on TV here in the US saying, hey, why don't you move north? We got a place for you. So I'm sure a lot of scientists are listening to that. We're going to go to a break shortly, but first, BioCentury and Advara are running a survey together to better understand cancer clinical trials. Want to help us identify bottlenecks and best practices to improve trial execution? Go to biocenturysurvey.com. The survey only takes 5 minutes. And as a bonus, respondents will get a complimentary copy of the findings. And hey, don't forget, BioCentury's back to school signature issue. It's our signature issue. It is out now, and for immediate access, you can go to biocenturybacktoSchool.com. Steve did a kind of an epic 7-part plus podcast reimagining of what FDA could be. And if you go to that, you can get access to BioCentury, as well as Steve's piece, edited by my colleagues Selena Koch and Simone Fishburne, our editor-in-chief. We'll be back in a moment.
BioCentury This Week is brought to you by BioCentury Grand Rounds Europe. Grand Rounds, BioCentury's R&D conference, will make its European debut in 2025. Join us to debate key translational bottlenecks and unlock scientific breakthroughs with commercial potential. Connect with VCs, academic innovators, and biopharma R&D and BD leaders to explore cutting-edge advancements in early-stage R&D as we dive into disease biology, therapeutic modalities, and enabling technologies. Join us for the inaugural BioCentury Grand Rounds Europe in Cambridge, UK, the September 17th to 19th. Register and learn more at biocenturygrandroundseurope.com.
We're back. Stephen, you have been thinking about Insmed. Tell us what you're finding.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. Insmed is what I would say is a maybe classic biotech story in that it's a nearly 40-year going overnight success. So maybe just a very, very quick history. Maybe this will sound familiar from a lot of other success stories that take a long time to come. So Insmed was founded as a diabetes company. And when that didn't work, it had several reinventions of itself, from being a growth factor company to biosimilars. And, a lot of this was, like in lots of biotech companies, not successful. And so, at the end of 2008, Insmed found itself with a market cap of 57 million and not a really clear path forward. And so this is where I think that the story started to get interesting, or not, depending on your perspective. So they did a very, very small deal where they brought in a drug inhalation platform and started working on the lead program, which was basically an inhaled formulation of a 50, 60-year-old antibiotic. And that's partly why I think a lot of people maybe have overlooked Insmed for a while. I mean, if you look 10 years back, that was the lead program. They had a inhaled formulation of this antibiotic for an orphan setting that they were running through late-stage trials. And this was at a time when, everyone was focused on PD-1s or CAR-Ts or CRISPR. And so wasn't exactly maybe the sexiest pipeline around. And so I think that's maybe partly explains why they were largely overlooked. But then, like lots of these companies, they came across an asset that they were able to find, new opportunity for. So in 2016, they did a deal with AstraZeneca that brought in a DPP-1 inhibitor, which had been developed for sort of pulmonary indications, and they found a new one for it, bronchiectasis. Ran a phase 2 trial, was successful in the phase 2 trial, and then moved it into phase 3. And that's really where things started to take off for them. And that just read out last year. So they had positive phase 3 data in bronchiectasis for 2 different doses. And basically, it's been one of the hottest stocks of the past several years. Almost every big specialist fund has an ownership stake in them, and they are now trading just above $30 billion. So it's quite a remarkable sort of turnaround here from being a largely unknown or maybe not often talked about company to now being basically one of the hottest biotechs in the sector.
So, Stephen, I mean, as you say, classical biotech story. Of course, every company that's not doing well wants to have that end. Right. It doesn't always work out that way. I think you earlier sort of referred to it as similar to the Horizon story, and that ended up being a takeout by Amgen, of course, for $24 billion.
$28 billion, I think, was the takeout for Horizon. And
obviously, the question now is, does this make Insmed a prime takeout target? And maybe you can expand on the analogy with Horizon for the audience.
Sure. No, I think it's a good analogy, and I think there's a good parallel here potential because, so the reason I see similarities between Insmed and Horizon Pharma was because Horizon Pharma, for all intents and purposes, was a fairly small specialty pharma that also had in-licensed a largely sort of discarded drug that was targeting IGF, a target that had long been sort of gone after and kind of lost its luster per se. But they found a new place in thyroid eye disease where you could use it, and it not only worked in the clinic, but proved to be a much larger and more lucrative commercial opportunity than anybody had really anticipated. And that sort of shot Horizon up to being this sort of large cap company that, as you say, was eventually taken up by Amgen. Insmed is similar in that they also acquired an asset, as I said, and has now, what they are projecting to be potentially a $5 billion peak sales in bronchiectasis alone, an indication that doesn't have any approved drugs. And they're also looking at expansion opportunities into chronic rhinosinusitis without nasal polyps. And Simone, one of your favorite indications, hidradenitis suppurativa.
You're so fluent in that.
And, looking at a sort of pipeline in a product just there. But then on top of that, they are getting some other assets out of their inhaled platform that they had acquired in 2010. They also have an inhaled formulation of treprostinil that just had positive phase 2b data in pulmonary arterial hypertension. So you kind of line this up. They have one blockbuster now coming that just got approved for bronchiectasis. They have another one that's going into phase 3 that they think has $2 billion potential. So at a $30 billion valuation, they kind of look like they might be maybe too big to be acquired at this point with
that's
multiple
what I'm kind of
drivers.
wondering. I mean, they'd be very expensive to buy. What you're saying is that the value isn't exclusively in the lead asset. I mean, maybe predominantly. And of course, and Jeff can give you the URL, of course, but this really does relate to our back to school essay of 2 years ago, where we talked about the tier jumpers. Mm-hmm. And this baby jumped from the under $5 billion tier to the $20+ billion tier. And, who knows, maybe marching to that 50+, who knows?
It's moving quick, but I want to go back to the Horizon parallel as well, because I think that's also a potential road that this goes. You can foresee a scenario in which, and something maybe that Insmed obviously needs to maybe protect against, because the reason Horizon ended up getting acquired is because they essentially got a little bit too far ahead of themselves in terms of their guidance for the growth that they were going to see from Tepezza, that lead asset. And effectively, they guided for too quick a growth. That growth didn't show up, and so they had to pull back. The stock then pulled back, and it reached a point to where it basically became an acquisition target, and Amgen was able to take it out, as you said, for $28 billion. And you could foresee a scenario in which something similar could happen if Insmed is too aggressive with their guidance on the growth for Insupri. And so I think that's something they need to, be wary of, take the long, good advice of, under promise and over deliver rather than being too aggressive here. But $5 billion peak sales for one indication here.
Yeah, I mean,
feels pretty aggressive to me. We'll see where this goes.
But we do know, with all the conversation about farmers needing late-stage assets and the fact that there aren't that many of them.
Yeah.
What's 10 billion here or there?
10 billion is one thing, 30 is another. This is a pretty
Well, I meant
large
like in
pill to
terms of
swallow.
I meant in terms of differential. But I mean, let's just acknowledge one more thing. It's also a different regulatory environment. So in that takeout, there was a sort of FTC that made it take forever. And I think that there was some kind of oversight of that, whereas I think now it's considered a more friendly environment for takeouts.
Yeah. No, I think you're right. But it's, again, I just think it's been really interesting diving into the past of Insmed and sort of looking at this success story, and, you know, something that is one of these success stories that we should celebrate from our sector. This is one of the areas where, you know, it's fun to see a company get a win like this.
And a disease that's had nothing get the breakthrough.
That's right.
All right. Thank you for that, Stephen. Stephen will have a story out early this week on Insmed. And as Simone mentioned, our back to school 2 years ago focused on tear jumpers, building the road to sustainable biotechs. If you'd like to check that out, drop me a line and we can set you up with a free trial. And it's a great story. We look at 17 growth companies, and Simone, Stephen, and Lauren Martz wrote that piece. It's quite interesting looking at companies like Insmed as they jump up the ranks. When Stephen told me he was working on the Insmed story, I was shocked that they were all of a sudden, like your kids, like all of a sudden they grow up so fast. Steve, quickly before we go, signs of life from Senator Cassidy. What's going on?
Senator Cassidy wrote a letter to Robert F. Kennedy Jr., the HHS secretary, last week, calling on him to publicly endorse the pertussis vaccine, actually a combination vaccine that includes the pertussis antigen. Cassidy noted that there's an outbreak of pertussis in his state, Louisiana, that's resulted in deaths and hospitalizations, and that it's growing in other states in the United States. It will be interesting to see what Kennedy's response to this is. For years in his life before he was at HHS, he cast doubts about the pertussis vaccine, about its use in the United States and internationally. He canceled or postponed funding for Gavi, the organization that's the largest funder of vaccination in developing countries around the world, since becoming HHS secretary. And he used concerns about a different pertussis vaccine as a justification for pausing funding for Gavi internationally. It will be very, very interesting, and I think important, both from a public health standpoint and politically, to see how Kennedy responds to this call from Cassidy. And since we're talking about vaccines and Cassidy, I think, the other thing to point out that's really important, of course, is that CDC's ACIP, which has been reconfigured with appointees from Secretary Kennedy, will be meeting this week, Thursday and Friday. There's going to be a great deal of attention, obviously, on what they do. Senator Cassidy actually called for the meeting to be postponed. That doesn't seem to be in the cards. So it's quite possible we're going to see a bigger showdown between Kennedy and Cassidy over vaccines and public health issues going forward.
All right. Thanks for that, Steve. Steve's story, along with the others that we spoke about, available at biocentury.com. Thanks for tuning in. If you've liked what you've heard, subscribe, give us a thumbs up, drop us a note. We'd love to hear from you. And a special thanks to Kendall Square Orchestra, which provides the music for BioCentury this week. The group is now in its 8th season, gearing up for its kickoff concert. Tickets on sale. The group connects science and technology professionals and other members of the greater Boston community to collaborate, innovate, and inspire through music while supporting causes related to healthcare and education.
BioCentury would like to thank IQVIA Biotech for supporting the BioCentury This Week podcast. Learn why IQVIA Biotech is proud to be the go-to CRO supporting biotechs from innovation to patient impact. Visit IQVIAbiotech.com.